Good afternoon, and welcome back to the Nutrient Management Seminar Series for February 16th. This afternoon, we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Tom Jensen, who will be presenting on A Farmer's Guide to Fertilizing, considering the present state of the fertilizer industry. Dr. Tom Jensen's background includes research, extension, and farm-level consulting experience in crops and soil. He comes from a mixed irrigated farm in southern Alberta and received his scientific and agronomic training at the University of Lethbridge and at the University of Alberta. He has experience in soil survey, nutrient management, conservation tillage research and extension, and soil conservation and soil remediation. He's worked as a regional director for the International Plant Nutrition Institute before retiring in 2019. He now does some instruction of soil science and agronomy at the University of Lethbridge and Olds College, and private soils and agronomy consulting. Dr. Jensen, it's a pleasure having you here today. Looking forward to your presentation.
Good afternoon. My name is Tom Jensen, and I'm a soil science instructor and adjunct professor at the University of Lethbridge. Previously, I worked with the International Plant Nutrition Institute, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today and talk about the present state of the fertilizer industry. I would rename my presentation A Farmer's Guide to Fertilizing, considering the present state of the fertilizer industry. So I'll just roll along. This is a pre-recorded presentation, but we will have an opportunity for questions and answer, a live session after you view this presentation. Just a quick review what the plant nutrients are. This is the official list of nutrients that plants need to grow, and the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen they get from air and water. The mineral nutrients are usually obtained by absorption of the roots from the soil. We break the mineral nutrients into two groups just based on how much is used in the plant. It doesn't mean that the major nutrients are more important and that the micros are less important. It just means plants use quite a bit of the major nutrients and they use smaller amounts of the micros, but they're just as important for plant growth. It's important to realize that plants in any one year, or a crop in any one year when they're growing, source their nutrients from many different places. They get some from the organic matter in the soil. They get some from the mineral and humus particles in the soil. They get some from low solubility compounds from inorganic fertilizer that is precipitated out. They can source nutrients from inorganic and organic fertilizers and so forth. So there's a long list. Irrigation water, a little bit comes down in the rainfall, but just to realize there's sort of a misconception that we have to add all the nutrients every year. Thank goodness we don't, because it would be very expensive. Plus, soils are capable of supplying quite a bit of the nutrients, especially some of the micronutrients, on a continuing basis. Just a quick review what the main fertilizers are that we use here in Western Canada. Of course, for nitrogen, anhydrous ammonia and urea, to a lesser amount, the urea ammonium nitrate solution. We used to have quite a bit of ammonium nitrate, well, some anyways in the market, but it's not very available anymore for security reasons. As far as phosphorus, we primarily use monoammonium phosphate, or 1152-0. But there is quite a bit in some pockets in Western Canada of ammonium polyphosphate. This is the liquid equivalent, and both of these can work very well as phosphorus sources. There are other phosphorus forms that can be obtained, but we mostly use 1152.0 and 1034.0. As far as potash, usually we have red potash or white potash, but realize there are other potassium sources, potassium sulfate or potassium nitrate. These tend to be more expensive and are used more for some specialty high value crops that need a specific source different from potassium chloride. As far as sulfur, the biggest use is ammonium sulfate, either in a granular or a crystal form, but there is quite a bit of elemental sulfur used, especially this material that is 10% bentonite clay. But there are some farmers trying what we call a mixture of compost and elemental sulfur spread on fields every 4 or 5 years, depending on the rate applied. Now, it's important to realize that, especially farms that have livestock operations, they recycle the nutrients and livestock manures, and this can be an extremely beneficial and important source of nutrients for plants. So, enough of the introduction. I'll jump right into my main topic. How do we decide on fertilizer rates in a time of fluctuating fertilizer and crop prices? There's no simple answer, but I'll review some basic principles, and then I'll give some examples of what's happening with grain and fertilizer prices and how a farm might approach their fertilizer rates depending on crop and fertilizer prices. So as far as response to supplemental nutrients, if we compare 3 situations, A, where we have a low availability of nutrients in the soil, B, where we have medium availability, and C, where we have high availability. If we look over on the right of this diagram, when we have low availability and we start adding supplemental nutrients, no matter which nutrient it is, we tend to get a very good response, and that response continues up to a certain range, what we call maximum response. If we have a medium range, we have a modest increase in yield, and then we reach that maximum sooner. If we have a high availability, we really don't get very little response at all. And so, of course, when you have a low available soil for a nutrient, that's when you get your fastest and your biggest economic return. Now, talking a little bit about wheat prices, this shows wheat prices from 1960 up to the year 2020. Of course, there's always some fluctuation, and generally wheat prices, of course, have increased from the 1960s up to now. Part of that is inflation, but we do have some periods where we had quite high grain prices. The last big spike for wheat was back in 2008. Got up to $12 US at that time. And we are seeing right now in the end of 2020 and into 2021, we are seeing prices going up quite well. Now, this is just another way to look at world grain prices. I'll compare wheat, corn, and soybean, as those values are quite easily available. This just shows that at different times, there's always fluctuation. This is where we had the last peak of prices back in 2008. And then, of course, prices went down towards the end of 2008 and down a little bit lower, 2009. As of the 10th of February, 2021, we're sitting at $7.90. And this is Canadian dollar, Canadian dollars per bushel. And the futures are actually looking quite promising at this point. So a little higher now than the futures, but futures are still, I would say, good prices, $7.60 a bushel. We're seeing corn up quite high right now, $5.64 a bushel, and futures are down a bit to $4.52. Soybean, right now, I didn't have soybean futures, but I thought I'd throw canola in here. As of the 10th of February, $15.50 a bushel, very high, good price, as high pretty well as what it was in June of 2008. And if we look at the futures, the markets are anticipating that with these high prices, there's going to be more acres of canola planted, and there'll be a bigger supply. And so the future prices are down a bit from right now, but still pretty decent prices, $12.14 a bushel. So it's important to realize there's always a relationship between crop prices, grain prices, and fertilizer prices. The fertilizer industry people, here's from IFA, this was back in 2008, but they say current fertilizer prices are an illustration of the principles of supply and demand. They reflect a properly functioning but very tight global market. What that means is there's usually when grain prices go up, fertilizer prices go up. And when grain prices go down, fertilizer prices will go down too. And so this shows, I want to show you what happened in 2008 and 2009. This shows fertilizer prices in Western Canada. So when we had the high prices in June of 2008, high grain prices, I should say, we had correspondingly high prices in fertilizer. Then when grain prices went down in 2009, the fertilizer prices were a little delayed in going down, but they came down. And so the fertilizer prices almost always follow grain prices unless there's some supply chain, some big supply chain problem, but they usually track pretty close to each other. Now, because there was a delay in fertilizer prices, and part of that is because the fertilizer companies and the dealers had higher priced inventory on hand. They were hesitant to drop the prices because they had a lot of money invested in what they had stored. And because the fertilizer prices didn't drop as fast as the farm prices, how did the farmers react? And I'll show you what happened in North America. As we went into 2009 and planting in the spring, the nitrogen use went down by 15%. And so farmers understand that in order to get good yields, they have to use nitrogen pretty well every year. And when the prices were still high, they cut back a little bit on nitrogen, but only 15%. However, for phosphorus and potassium, and I could add sulfur also, they tended to purchased and apply almost half as much as they did the year before in 2008. So there's a reason there's a different response of phosphorus and potassium compared to nitrogen, and I'll discuss that a little bit. So here's some more numbers to look at. This is what, let's look at the fertilizer first. So in early December, a lot of farms were pre-buying fertilizer. One, before the end of the year, there's some tax reasons for that. And they heard that prices were going up. So here's some actual prices I got from one farm friend. They paid in early December, $4.30 for urea per metric ton. These are Canadian dollars. 715 for 1152, 400 for potash, 340 for sulfate. Now, as of yesterday, when I'm doing this presentation on the 10th of February, urea is now up to 665. Potash has went up to 950, or sorry, phosphate, and potash 525, sulfate 490. So if we look what's been the percent increase since early December, 54% increase in nitrogen, 34% in phosphate, 31% in potash, 44% in sulfate. Now, what happened with prices at this time? If at the end of November, wheat was 540, now it's farmers are getting 790. So we've seen a 46% increase in the price of wheat. Canola was already fairly high at the end of November. It has gone up from $13 to about 15.5. That's an 18.2% increase. Barley was also fairly high back at the end of November. It's now up to 525, and that's a little under 20% increase. So what do the fall futures look like? Again, I showed you these numbers before, but wheat is staying pretty strong in the fall futures, fall 2021. Canola, a little weaker, down to about a little over $12 a bushel. Barley prices for the futures is looking strong at 570. Now, the big question is what's going to happen going forward? So just to review, back in the 2008 to 2009 cycle, high prices and then lower prices. In 2019, farmers cut back 15% on nitrogen and 50% on phosphorus and potash, and I could add sulfur there too. What's going to happen now? If we look, 2020 compared to 2019 or 2020, what's happening? Probably in this year, in the 2021, nitrogen prices are probably about as high as they're going to get, but they could go up a little bit more before spring, or at least stay level. Same with phosphorus, same with potassium, same with sulfur. So I think going into the spring, we're going to see fairly high fertilizer prices. The big question is what'll happen going into 2022. And if I knew exactly what grain prices were going to do at the end of 2021, going into 2022, I could give you an accurate guess at what fertilizer prices will do. I would think, now this is just my guess, I'm not an economic expert, but I am an agronomic scientist, is that I think we're going to see grain prices come down some, and we're going to see fertilizer prices also come down. Now, again, there'll be a lag phase from when the crop prices go down a bit and when the fertilizer prices will also decrease. What about phosphorus? As I said, in that 2008-2009 cycle, we saw farmers cut back a lot on phosphorus and potassium. And the ideal way to manage phosphorus, maybe I can talk about that, that'll help us understand why farmers were able to do that and their crop yields didn't crash. If they had cut back that much in nitrogen, we would have seen a pretty good crash in crop yields. But from research from London, long-term research at the Rothamsted Research Station, I'll just show you the next slide from Dr. Johnny Johnston. From long-term research, they have shown that on their soils, if they can build up available phosphorus to about 20 parts per million, that would be about, anyways, at 20 parts per million, if they're there, then they find that the soil remains quite productive as far as phosphorus. And if they match phosphorus fertilizer applications with crop removals, they can maintain that productivity. There's no economic or agronomic sense to build the soil up higher than that. And so once we get up to a certain level of phosphorus availability, again, this 20 parts per million, I've seen research from Western Canada by Dr. Ross McKenzie, very good research, showing that on a lot of our soils, the ideal parts per million may be up around 25 parts per million. And because our soils are different than the ones in the UK. Now, what does that mean? Phosphorus in a soil is actually can be described in three pools. One pool is what is immediately soluble in soil water. It's a small amount of phosphorus. And there's a large amount of phosphorus stored, a lot of it sort of locked away in the soil, not very available, but it can be quite large, 400 to 2,000 pounds per acre, depending on the soil. But there's this important pool of phosphorus called labile phosphorus. It can be small or it can be up to 200 pounds of P2O5 per acre, depending on how the soil has been managed. And this is the pool that's really critical for maintaining and supplying our crops. And I'll just go back to that for a minute. So if we build a soil up to, let's say, 20, 25 parts per million of available phosphorus, we're up at a higher end of labile phosphorus. And this allows the soil to comfortably supply needed phosphorus to a crop. If we let labile phosphorus get too low, this would be equivalent something down at maybe 4 to 6 parts per million. Then the soil does not have the capability to supply phosphorus as well to the crop. So what should you do when there's fluctuating grain and fertilizer prices? My best advice is to seek advice. Get advice from a good crop consultant, whether, that might be your professional agrologist, crop consultant, or a certified crop advisor. They can help you determine what the availability is in your soil through soil testing and analysis, and they can advise you what to do, whether you need, if you get high phosphorus and potash prices, do you really need to fertilize with that high-priced fertilizer, or can you back off for a year or two until the prices come down? So I just want to show you, you can't see the numbers on this chart, but I had a good friend. Unfortunately, he's passed away with a heart attack, but his farm customers really liked working with him because every spring he would go over what their crop choices were, what the fertilizer prices were. He was very good at economics, and he could show them what their projected net return would be from different crops. And he developed his own spreadsheet, and he'd work with his customers. So a good crop consultant or certified crop advisor can advise you quite well on seeing what your net returns might be for different crops at different fertilizer prices. So let's look at if fertilizer prices change, should you change your fertilizer rates? And so let's look at nitrogen. Let's hold wheat at a low price, let's say a little under $4 a bushel, not a great price, not what we have right now, $3.80. And we look, here's the price of urea going from $3.44 per metric ton. A lot of you wish you could get that price right now, but up to $444, up to $585, up to $700. Now we're not that high, but it is getting up there. How much would your optimum N rate decrease? So at the low urea price, the optimum rate would be 100 pounds of N per acre. And it goes down to 90 at 444 per metric ton, down to 80 at 585, and down to 60 if urea was 743. Now this is one example on one soil and the crop response. Now the important thing to look at, if urea price went up from 344 to 743, that's a 116% increase in the price of urea. However, the optimum N rate was still 60% of what it was at the lower urea price. So we call that, it's just because the fertilizer price goes up, for example, doubles, it doesn't mean that you cut back half on fertilizer. Agronomically and economically, you have to look at it and figure out what the optimum rate is. And that's where a good crop consultant can help you. So what we saw in the last cycle of high grain prices, high fertilizer prices, and then grain prices crashed, followed by delayed fertilizer, farmers didn't reduce their nitrogen rates much. But they did reduce phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and micronutrients. So when might this be valid? It could be valid on a field where there's been a good program of building up the availability, especially of phosphorus and potassium. And you can actually cut back a bit, wait for phosphorus and potassium prices to go down, and then you can actually play catch up in a couple of years. But you got to be careful. If you try and do that for 4 or 5 years, then your yields are going to start dropping considerably. If you're running on a field where there's not a good buildup of phosphorus and potassium, then you shouldn't cut back too much on your phosphorus and potassium rates. So a lot of it depends on the availability of the nutrients on that field. So with that, I'd like to stop there, and if there's any question, I'd be happy to